All right, everybody, let's get started. Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series. My name is Chris Smith, and I work here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, and it's good to be with you for another edition of our regular program, again, the Lunchtime Discovery Series. Now, this program is organized and coordinated by the folks at the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality, every week working with us to bring you fantastic program where we meet interesting people who are doing interesting things out there in the world of environmental education, science, nature, conservation, going above and beyond all the time, especially right here in the state of North Carolina, doing great work. So I'm glad that you are all tuned in today for this program. I should say, happy summer. Yesterday was the first day of summer, which maybe it kind of works out that for today's Lunchtime Discovery, we're going to kind of take a trip out to the coast because maybe everybody's got vacation on the mind now that it's summertime. Maybe I do a little bit. And so we can, at least in a way, get out to the coast and enjoy a little bit of sun and water. Maybe. We'll see what our guest presenter has in store for today. As we go throughout the program, whether you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook, make sure that you drop questions for our guest speaker today as we go along. Cue those up for me. After the presentation, I will ask your questions to our guest. So make sure that you're dropping those in the chat as we go along. And let's get started. Today's guest is calling in, visiting all the way from Morehead City. He works for the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality within the Division of Marine Fisheries as the Artificial Reef Coordinator. Everyone, please welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series, Jordan Byram. Hi, Jordan. Jordan, we can't hear your audio.
There we go. How's that, Chris?
Perfect.
Great. So thanks for having me. Like you said, I am down here based out of Morehead City. We're looking forward to a good talk today about artificial reefs. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. So many of you, go ahead.
I was saying, I'm looking forward to it.
Glad you are. All right. So many of you might be familiar with artificial reefs, but for those of you who are not, North Carolina has a pretty extensive artificial reef program. We're all based here out of the Morehead City office. But before we jump into artificial reefs, we're going to talk about just what is a reef. So many of you have probably seen Blue Planet or Planet Earth or something like that, and you've seen these magnificent looking coral reefs across the South Pacific or the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, places like that. We do have coral reefs here in North Carolina, but a lot of our reefs are comprised of kind of limestone outcroppings or a big series of ledges that run offshore that might only be a couple feet high. Inshore, we have a pretty extensive network of oyster reefs here in North Carolina. They're not nearly as colorful and majestic as the coral reefs that you've seen on planet Earth, but nonetheless are important critical habitat here in North Carolina. And that's the one thing that all these types of reefs have in common. These are habitats for a variety of species and are centers for biodiversity. So artificial reefs are meant to emulate these natural reef habitats. Here in North Carolina, reefs are built using a variety of materials. Typically, we're building these with big steel-hulled ships that have been cleaned appropriately. We use demolished bridge materials when Department of Transportation is taking down a bridge near the coast, and it works out well. We can get a hold of some bridge material. We use a lot of recycled concrete pipe, like you see in that picture there, that's been damaged before or something like that. And we also use things called reef balls that are these concrete dome structures that have a bunch of holes in them that are specifically designed for use in artificial reefs. And so all of this really, the purpose of all of this is to create habitat and provide fishing and diving opportunities for the people of North Carolina. And so we have these reefs scattered everywhere, and you'll see that in just a moment. Before we jump deep into how these artificial reefs are built, we're going to talk a little bit about how the reefs work, artificial reefs and natural reefs. I'm going to use oysters as an example because we have we have a lot of oysters here in North Carolina, and it's a really kind of pertinent example. So when oysters spawn, oyster larvae are kind of transported around Pamlico Sound by the wind and tide. They don't really have the ability to move laterally in the water column, but they can move up and down, adjust their buoyancy. So these oyster larvae are looking for a place to settle and to call home. So oysters are sessile organisms, which means that once they stick on something, that's where they're going to grow. They can't pick up and move. So they're looking for an appropriate place that has the right amount of food, the right amount of current, and probably near some other oysters. So they're looking for a variety of kind of environmental cues to tell them, hey, this is a place that I want to live. So oysters go and they're moving around, and reefs are fairly noisy places, so it's easy to see how an oyster can actually find a place. Oyster larvae can find a place to settle based on sound. So as these oysters settle and grow, they begin to basically build on this reef, and the reef becomes higher, has a little bit higher profile, a little higher elevation, and through time, these reefs grow and get larger and larger. And begins to provide some shelter for small fish. And those small fish, in turn, bring larger fish there, and then larger fish. And eventually we get to the size fish that people are interested in catching and looking at. And ultimately, you've kind of built an entire food web around this reef. So just sum that up to say that as we build habitat, this in turn helps enhance fish stocks in those areas. So the reef program in North Carolina the state took over kind of a formal reef program in the 1970s. Prior to that, there were individuals and groups that carried all kinds of things out to the ocean and dumped them to fish on, things like washing machines and automobiles, all kinds of crazy things. The state put some guardrails on that starting in the 70s. And the program has expanded considerably since that time. So we have reefs, 69 reefs, and they range basically from north of Oregon Inlet all the way down to the South Carolina line. If you look here on the map, you can see that some of these reefs in Pamlico Sound have the orange dots. So those are a special type of artificial reef. They're called an oyster sanctuary. And that's part of our oyster restoration work that we do here at Marine Fisheries. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So our reef program is actually funded from a couple different sources. We get some money from the state legislature, but the bulk of our operating expenses really are funded through a U.S. Fish and Wildlife sport fish restoration grant. So for many of you may not realize, but when you go and buy a boat or you buy fishing tackle or anything like that, a trolling motor or anything, there's actually an excise tax that's levied on the manufacturer. And so the money from this is basically goes to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's then distributed to state fish and game agencies. There's a similar thing for wildlife restoration. But we use this money in the reef program for our kind of day-to-day operating expenses. So we use this in planning reef projects, permitting reef projects. We buy some material with it. All of our monitoring, both diving and side scan and multi-beam surveys, are funded through this sport fish restoration money, as well as going and talking to members of the public. We talk to school groups, we talk to fishing clubs, we go to like the North Carolina Seafood Festival. All these sorts of things are funded through sport fish restoration money. Most of our offshore work is typically expensive because it takes a lot to move materials offshore. And so this is actually funded through recreational fishing license sales here at the Division of Marine Fisheries. So I'm going to walk you through basically the process of from start to finish of how we go about picking a spot to build a reef, vetting that spot, and then actually constructing it and monitoring it. So a few years ago, we constructed AR-380. This is here in Bogue Sound. Many of you probably vacation here. If you look and see where AR-380 is, this is actually Morehead City here. Atlantic Beach is right here, Beaufort Inlet. And so there was some local demand and local interest in a reef to have a new reef in this area. There were not any inshore reefs in the area at that time. And so we found what we thought might be a suitable spot. And this reef is great because it's accessible by kayaks, by small boats. They're in fairly protected waters in Bogue Sound. So once we had kind of a general area, somewhere in Bogue Sound kind of picked out, we started to narrow that down. And so you can see this kind of larger gray box here. This is the general area where we began to look for a reef project, to construct this reef project. And we're looking for have a couple criteria we've got to hit. We already kind of had public input for something in this general area. The next piece is that we want to avoid any type of user conflicts. If that's an area where historically people have gone and trawled for shrimp, or there's a lot of boat traffic or something like that, we don't want to build a reef there where it's going to be in the way. And the third piece is just utilization of the reef. I mentioned earlier that we build these for the people to fish and to dive on them. You can build the best reef in the world, but if it's off in the middle of nowhere where nobody's going to go to it, it hasn't really met its full purpose. So with that, we dug a little deeper. You can see here we're about 2/10 of a nautical mile from the intercoastal waterway, this channel here. So we're an appropriate distance away from a navigation channel. So that's checkbox kind of number one. The next piece is looking for any type of natural resources that are around the site. We're prohibited from building on top of not natural like live bottom or oysters or seagrass. We want to leave the natural habitats alone. We want to build on kind of featureless bottom where there isn't anything already. So we do that through a couple ways. One of those is diving, but the big one is side scan and multi-beam surveys. So we have this boat. It's a 25-foot Parker that takes two people to run, basically one person operating the boat, another person operating side scan and multi-beam data collection equipment. So we use this. It's got this very large transducer, this big yellow thing. It's lowered over and fixed to the side of the boat down in the water column. And we use this to help map the sites. So we use this for mapping natural oyster reefs and natural kind of live bottom habitats. We use it in this case to select a site for a new reef. In larger reef projects, we monitor reef construction as the project's underway to make sure materials are going where we want them. And then ultimately, all this information is made available to the public on our website. So we conducted a side scan survey here. You can see this proposed reef boundary is the green box. And in here, it does not show any type of oyster reef or seagrass. These are the two things that we would expect to see in Bogue Sound. So we're all clear there. So we're going to move on to the next one. This is making sure we have a suitable depth. So this is a multi-beam survey. It basically shows water depth. So we would see if there was a big high spot or a big hole, a big low spot, or a channel or something like that. Everything here is basically around 7 feet deep, which is important when it comes time to kind of pick what material we're going to use. The fourth thing is backscatter. So this is a pretty interesting tool that we have as part of this boat, and it gives us a relative hardness of the bottom. So sand is going to show up different than like soft mud. Rock is going to show up different than sand. So here you can see everything's kind of this grayish tan color. We have basically consistent bottom throughout the whole piece, throughout the whole your proposed site. So we did a sediment grab, and this is the exact kind of bottom that we're looking for. We get some sandy mud here. It's not so soft that materials are going to sink down into the mud, and it's not really kind of fluffy sand that when the current goes by it, we're going to get holes scoured around the material. So we've kind of checked all the boxes for an appropriate site. So now it's time for us to make some big decisions as far as material. I mentioned before, we use ships, we use concrete pipe, we use all these kinds of things for reef materials. But really, it is on a case-by-case basis. Like any project, we've got kind of competing factors to make sure that this project is a success. So we have a budget that we have to maintain, that we have to stay between. Considerations about logistics, an appropriate staging area. Do we have the equipment to move this type of material? If we don't, is there a nearby contractor who has it? We want to make sure that we're choosing an appropriate material for the site, something that's not going to be really high up in the water column, that might present a hazard to navigation for folks moving their boats around there. And the last one is also biological considerations. For instance, we wouldn't sink a ship, steel-hulled ship, to try to grow oysters on it. We're probably going to choose like a concrete or a natural material like limestone or oyster shell, something like that. So these three kind of competing factors, you really kind of dictate what types of materials we use for which project. So for this project, we chose reef balls. These are the small things in the bottom right-hand picture here, these concrete domes with holes all in them. And they're a few feet tall and I think 3 or 4 feet wide. Appropriate sized for this reef site. They make these things that are 5, 6 feet tall, that are really great for offshore, but wouldn't really be appropriate in an inshore site like this. So from there, we have a permitting process. Even as a state agency who issues some permits, we still have to go through all the state and federal permitting processes. And after that, it's time to build. So I'm just showing you guys this just so you kind of understand all that's involved in moving reef materials to a reef site. Just consider that every one of these projects is slightly different. They're all generally the same in that we have some material, we're storing it somewhere on the shore, we're putting on a boat, and it's going someplace else. But every project has its own intricacies and own kind of complexities that we have to consider. So we get to the site. This is actually one of the DMF vessels here. This is the RV Shell Point, this barge with 32 or so of these reef balls loaded on it. And they're heading to the site. The boat below, you can see these guys are out here. They have metal poles in the bottom, and these are marking the specific locations for each of these reef balls. And you can see that on the map here. Each of these pink stars is a spot where a reef ball is going to go. So the way this works, basically, the guys pull up on the barge from downwind or down current, that davit holding the reef ball, and pull up right to the stake and lower that in. That was the last one for the day. We're taking some environmental information down, as well as just kind of timing. And so from there, it's time to kind of look and see what these things really look like. So monitoring on these reefs out in the ocean, we typically do a lot of scuba diving for that. But inshore, it's not always easy to see. This is a pretty good day of visibility here. A lot of days you can't really see your hand in front of your face inshore. So we go back to the side scan. So this is just a whole kind of reef site view of AR380 right there. So the way I like to think about side scan is if you were shining a flashlight out of each side of the boat, you can see the material. It's kind of illuminated, and you get a shadow behind each of the reef balls. And so you can see here, each of these kind of fuzzy lines is the path that the boat took. And so we made 3 passes over this, stitched all those images together. And so we have all of this geo-reference. We know exactly where all this information, all these materials are, and we make this information available. So back to diving. So we do diving both inshore and offshore. Most of our offshore work on the reefs is focused on the stability and durability of reef materials. So I mentioned that we have, the reef program's been around since the 70s. We have reef materials on some of these sites that they're 50 years old now. And so we want to make sure that anything that we put out is going to be is going to be long lasting. It's going to be stable. We want it to stay on the reef site. We don't want it to move, and we want it to hold up through time. And so a lot of our work out in the ocean is really kind of focused on that. We do some video evaluation of the fish communities that are around there with GoPro cameras, both kind of roving diver sort of transects, as well as fixed on like a stand. And inshore, we do a lot of diving for oyster sampling. So you can see here, one of my coworkers has a crowbar in his hand and a basket full of oysters and rocks. And so that's going to go up to the boat. We're going to count and measure those oysters to help with some of the oyster population monitoring that we do. So this is a nearshore reef near Pine Knoll Shores. This is the tugboat Fort Fisher that was sunk. This is a little while ago, but I have a really cool video that kind of accompanies this video. So the way these boats are sunk, once they're cleaned of all the petroleum products and any type of insulation, anything that could float out, and inspected by the Coast Guard, holes are cut basically right above the water line. Pumps are used to flood the boat. It sinks, sits lower in the water, and eventually enough water rushes in for it to sink. So this was actually sunk right before Hurricane Florence, the week before, which was fortuitous timing. We were very excited to get that overboard before the hurricane hit. So immediately following that, a couple of my coworkers were on the first dive right here. You can see it's the Fort Fisher. They're going down to check it out. The first dive. I want you to just look here along the edge of the boat. As they're swimming along, we saw a small gag grouper, we saw a small shark, barracuda swimming on top of the ship. All right, I think I'm back. So these things are really very quickly kind of colonized by other fish that are around there. So this is at an existing site, so material wasn't very far, but in minutes there are already fish on this tugboat. So here's a tugboat that's been on the bottom for 10 or 15 years, I should say. This is tugboat Titan out of Bogue Inlet. And you can see the entire boat is encrusted with sponges, corals, and rhizoans. And just look at the amount of life that goes around here. This thing is absolutely covered. I can count 5 or 6 different species right there. I'm going to play this again. I want you guys to look here, kind of on the right-hand side. You can start to kind of make out that's actually a sand tiger shark. We didn't realize that shark was there until we were reviewing video footage the next day. So that's always exciting. These ships really are home to a lot of sand tiger sharks. This is a really, I think, probably important fact. If you look here inside, we call a fan of one. Oh, and there's another one inside this ship. One of the guys who used to work with us, we've done a bunch of diving. We call the sand tigers the golden retrievers of the ocean. They're kind of curious, wondering what they're doing, but overall harmless. So kind of funny. So a couple of the other projects that we've had going on recently. So I mentioned how a lot of our offshore work is funded through recreational fishing license money. So this is a recent project that was based out of the Wilmington port. So this concrete pipe was all donated. We got it at basically no charge. A lot of this came from Rinker Materials, who makes the concrete pipe. It was otherwise kind of cracked or damaged, came out of the mold wrong. They can't use it. They can't sell it. It costs a lot of money to throw it away. So they're happy to donate it to us. We got some more from actually the city of Wilmington. They had same sort of story, as well as about 1,100 tons from Columbus and Bladen County DOT yards. They had replaced a lot of concrete pipe following Hurricane Florence. And so they had a bunch of this sitting in a yard, taking up space. And the DOT engineer had speculated it would have cost about $65,000 for them to throw all this concrete pipe into a landfill. And so rather than do that, we worked out a deal where they could come and deliver it to us here at the port in Wilmington. And we staged it and then hired a contractor to load all this onto a barge and carried it offshore. So this went to AR 430 and AR 460, which are located off of Oak Island and then a little bit further down the beach near Ocean Isle. So this was done just here a month ago or so, actually loaded up and carried offshore. And they used a big forklift basically to drop the stuff off the side there inside the reef site. And so this is a great spot for anglers that are out king mackerel fishing, Spanish mackerel fishing. When flounder season opens, this will be a great spot for flounder fishing. as well. So after a while, concrete pipe begins to look kind of encrusted like this. Here's a video with some of our divers in the water. A lot of times these fish are very curious to know what's going on. You can see these amberjacks kind of swarming around almost. You can see, this concrete pipe here is 15 years old or older. It still looks like concrete pipe. It's just fully encrusted and full of growth. As you can see there, the amberjacks swimming around, checking the divers out. I mentioned also some of the stationary video because sometimes some species are a little more timid, aren't as interested in coming to check us out as others. So here's a sheep's head swimming by, and so there's some of these species are a little more cryptic or a little less out in the open, and so that's the purpose of having some of this stationary video from these reefs. You get to see species like this. I'll note that we've also seen a fair number of kind of tropical almost species, butterfly fish and some other things that you would think typically like you see those in an aquarium, not out in the ocean. But we do see some of these kind of tropical fish on some of our reef sites. So some other kind of high profile projects that we've done here recently. Many of you have probably vacationed on the Outer Banks, and you've probably driven over this older bridge, the Herbert C. Bonner Bridge over Oregon Inlet. The new bridge, as you can see it in the background, this is the Bass Night Bridge that was opened in 2019. Construction took several years, obviously, but more than a decade ago, a deal was struck between DOT and DMF to dispose of the old bridge on some reef sites. So this project was the single largest project that DMF's ever really been involved in as far as reef projects go. And so all this material, instead of crushing it up or hauling it to a landfill or something like that, which would have cost millions and millions and millions of dollars, it was actually all loaded onto barges and carried out to reef sites. So we got about 80,000 tons of concrete from this project. And you can see that it was offloaded basically just like this. Pilings, sections of the road bed, all of this. So this barge is set up with basically two big rails and big hydraulic pistons that just shove the material off the end, which is pretty neat, a pretty effective way to move the stuff offshore. So this project happened in 2020, and so this is a retired Coast Guard buoy tender that we renamed the Brian Davis in honor of a young man who passed away in a diving accident. His family and friends raised some money, and we paired that with some money that the Reef program had, and we're able to actually purchase this boat, have it cleaned, have it towed down and sunk. And this is about 14 or 15 miles offshore of Topsail Inlet. And so this is sunk basically in the same manner the others were, with holes cut, and then the ship is flooded and begins to sink. And his family and friends were all present on this boat. You can see kind of off to the right-hand side of the video. This was a project multiple years in the making, and it was a good way to honor a young man who really spent a lot of time diving on our artificial reefs. So another recent project that actually occurred in May, this was in Pamlico River. And so this is a project located, it's kind of outside the mouth of Bath Creek near Bayview. So we partnered with the Coastal Conservation Association of North Carolina, and they had some funding through both a CCA grant as well as from Grady White and Nutrien. To actually purchase these materials. So these are 3D printed concrete structures that are basically like a 3 foot by 3 foot cube. You can see all the holes in them. They're from a company based out of Raleigh called Matrix. So this is the first time that we've used materials like this. but they're concrete and kind of similar in form and function to some other things that we've used. So DMF, using the sport fish restoration money, we hired a contractor, local contractor there to load these things on his barge and carry these out to the reef site and actually deploy them. And so there were 100 of these structures that were deployed there at the reef site. And I think this will be a great spot for anglers that are out targeting speckled trout and red drum and flounder and stuff throughout for many, many more years to come. So there was a big kind of public presence there and a lot of media attention. It was a great little project that I think everyone really, really enjoyed. So I would be remiss to not talk about some of the other programs, reef building programs that we do here in the Habitat and Enhancement section. So we have a lot of oyster restoration work that occurs here. And that's kind of broken into two different programs, both oyster sanctuaries and then culch planting. So oyster sanctuaries have a lot in common with the kind of conventional artificial reef construction. They're kind of similar in scale and equipment and some of the materials used. So typically oyster sanctuaries are built using kind of high profile sort of materials. We use a lot of aggregate rock, limestone, riprap, things like that. And recently we've been building these things in basically large ridges that are 130 to 150 feet long and maybe 3 to 6 feet high, which works out well. Basically they're offloaded off of one side of the barge. And then the barge can just kind of move and build another row. And so these are built, I mentioned oyster sanctuaries earlier. So these are really built to help restore oyster populations in Pamlico Sound. So we site these things in very specific locations where they can grow oysters. Those oysters will spawn, and the oyster larvae are transported through Pamlico Sound by the wind and the current and tide to areas that are in need of oyster larvae. So these are protected from oyster harvest, so we can keep those large kind of brood stock oysters there, and they can continue to reproduce. So we build somewhere around 10 to 15 acres annually. Here recently, we've been partnered with the North Carolina Coastal Federation. It's been a pretty good deal for us. We actually purchased the material using state appropriated money, and Coastal Federation hires a contractor to actually go and deploy the things. So I mentioned we've built this, we use a lot of aggregate rock. So Cedar Island Oyster Sanctuary is our newest sanctuary. This is located in southern Pamlico Sound, kind of near the mouth of West Bay, near Cedar Island, not too far from the ferry. If any of you have ever taken the ferry from Cedar Island to Ocracoke, you've not been very far from this. So this, we actually started construction on year 2 earlier this week on Monday, and the second load of material should be going out today. And so this site, again, is built using limestone. We used some recycled concrete. We got some of that, some of that locally available, so it made sense to get that. But this is meant primarily as an oyster reef, but it happens to be great places to go and fish as well. For big red drum in the fall, North Carolina has a phenomenal fishery for these large red drum that come in the estuary to spawn in August, September, October. These are great places to go and fish for those fish, as well as the sheep's head and speckled trout fishing. So here's a map showing the oyster sanctuaries. You can see this the orange point is actually Cedar Island Oyster Sanctuary. And here is a bathymetry map of year 1 construction. So the way to look at this map, the cool colors, the blues are the seafloor bottom, and those are lower elevation. The bright colors are higher elevation. So you can see how this is built in ridges right here. So we've got, the site's about 75 acres in size. So we've got another 2 or 3 years of construction that can occur inside this same site. The boundary is this bold black line. And I mentioned, we build these things in ridges. It works very well as far as kind of efficiency for the marine contractor who's offloading the material, as well as it kind of has the right balance of interstitial space for our materials, and it really works well. So a good way that we figured out to make this happen. So the other shellfish rehabilitation program is culch planting. So culch is just a word we use for the small material that oysters actually settle on. So oyster shell, clam shell, small rock. So think like kind of golf ball to baseball size rock versus the very, very large stuff that we were using previously. So this is built in low relief. So instead of the 3 to 6 foot high ridges, think about this like a carpet, like a veneer of this small rock that's maybe 10 or 12 inches high. And so this began long before marine fisheries got involved, more than a century ago, basically with oyster fishermen going and putting their oyster shells back out in the areas where they harvested oysters from. And so this, we build somewhere between 40 to 50 acres or so a year. And this is scattered throughout the estuaries of North Carolina. So we have stockpile yards that range from Wanchese, Swan Quarter, Hoboken, Lower Noosh River, on down south into the New River and Hampstead area. And so we do this primarily with state-owned barges. The material is actually loaded onto the deck of the barge. And then you can see here this water cannon. There's a big diesel-powered water pump that actually washes the material off. And so we build these reefs, and you can see this kind of right-hand image. This is a backscatter image of a culch planting site. Remember I said backscatter gave you kind of a relative hardness. So here the light colors are where the rock and shell is. The dark colors are the kind of sandy muddy sand bottom that's surrounding that site. So you can see where the actual perimeter of the site really is, which is a really kind of useful, it's a useful tool when it comes to finding these things that are fairly low relief. So we do a lot of, I've hit on some of the oyster sampling that we do, but we do a lot of data collection in regards to oysters and monitoring oyster populations. And ultimately, this information is all really used to can help guide future restoration projects. So we're trying to collect as much information as we can to kind of maximize the impact of the money that we spend on oyster restoration. You're following some of the hurricanes that we've had. We've noticed some reefs fare better than others. There's typically a tremendous amount of water that moves down the Pamlico and Noosh rivers when there's large kind of inland flood events like following Hurricane Florence and likely Hurricane Matthew and Floyd a long time ago. But making decisions about where we site reefs and how we construct reefs to kind of increase the resiliency of them in these types of hurricane events. So with that, I've kind of alluded to how we make this information available to the public. So AR380, this was the first one that we spoke about. We have this available on our website. Works just like Google Maps. We're going to check out 380. So here it is in Bogue Sound. We can zoom in and actually see where each of these reef balls was placed. You can click on every one of them and get information about latitude, longitude, when it was put there, what it is, how many of them there were. And so we have this available for all of our reef sites, as well as all of the culch sites. And there's also things you can download and put those into Google Earth if you really want to get into the nitty gritty with it. But even if you're not a fisherman or a diver or anything like that, I think this is a really cool tool that you guys may be interested in seeing what all is out there. And how long the reef programs have been building things and how much stuff is really out in the coast of North Carolina. So with that, I will kind of turn the floor back over to Chris. Thank you.
Jordan, thank you very much. Let's have everybody give you a great big round of applause wherever they happen to be. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Okay, yeah, your link and email is there too, so people can get in touch perhaps or get access to some of that cool information you were just sharing. Folks, go ahead and start typing up those questions. I know you've got some. I know you're interested in this program. Put your questions into the chat on YouTube or into the comments on Facebook, and we're going to jump to those in just a moment as they come in. I was kind of surprised, Jordan, to learn about the washing machines that are now on the bottom of the ocean off our coast.
Well, they didn't last very long. I would speculate. There's a history of all kinds of probably biologically inappropriate materials that have been used. There the reef program ourselves not just in North Carolina, up and down the coast, used tires of all things in the 70s and 80s. And we still pick those up on the beach today. So extra incentive to not put anything out there that's not going to stay put.
That's fascinating stuff. Fascinating. So you mentioned that some of the benefits of artificial reefs are, they improve the biodiversity for fish, for anglers. But, North Carolina's coast gets scoured by hurricanes all the time. With sea level rise and climate change, we're seeing, more waters coming inland. Do reefs do anything to mitigate the effects of like these big storms or some of the sea level rise problems that we might be having?
So there's been a pretty big push, not necessarily from my group, but it's for on like living shorelines. So this is something that basically people can go and build. They're putting a rock or things like this instead of building a seawall in behind their house or something like that in estuaries. They build a living shoreline where it they put rock or something or shell or something like that out, and it grows oysters, and that kind of helps reduce some of the wave action. And prevents erosion and can actually help build some of the land kind of behind that. So there's been a renewed interest in that here in recent years that shows some promise. Okay,
I see. And I'm kind of curious, how does someone become an artificial reef coordinator?
It's not something that they talk about in career day anywhere in high school or anything like that. This is, I have a background in marine science, and started here in the reef program as a temporary 5 years ago, doing some of the sampling programs and just kind of helping out on whatever projects and whatever things we had going on, and got a little more familiar with how these reefs are studied, and then kind of all the kind of logistical marine contractor reef construction type piece of it. Which is kind of starkly in contrast with a lot of what people think about when they think being a marine biologist. We do a lot of work with that most people would classify as construction. So we try to keep the science involved in that and make the best decisions we can. But I spend a lot of my time working on things that most people would consider construction projects.
Well, I mean, that's kind of what it sounds like, an exciting job opportunity or an exciting career, because you are working like, all of your fish, your oyster biology. At the same time, you've got to combine that with how to create habitat for them to improve the coast.
It's a unique challenge.
Yeah. Those are the best kinds.
Yeah.
Yeah, I liked your one slide. You were just like creative problem solving. That's how we've got good people. They enjoy.
I'm surrounded by a team of very, very intelligent, very capable individuals that I would be remiss not mention them. I don't do this alone. We've got a good team of technicians and other biologists and operations folks here who help kind of make the magic happen.
Excellent stuff. So a question that's come in the chat now, Steve asks, would offshore wind farms also be considered artificial reefs? If it is, does DMF collaborate with energy companies to retrofit wind farms for fish habitat?
So I was on a webinar a little bit yesterday about some of the offshore wind stuff. It's not something that the Reef program has been kind of directly involved in. I will say, we look at some of the stuff down in the Gulf of Mexico around the oil rigs. There are there's a tremendous fishery around these oil rigs down in the Gulf of Mexico. That are basically just pilings and things driven into the seafloor. I would imagine that there's going to be some fishery of pelagic and some of the benthic species around the legs of these wind turbines. Whenever in the many years till that's kind of a reality.
There you go. Good question. Next one: are the reef balls also used as memorials for loved ones? Somebody says they saw a presentation about that being done.
Yeah, so we partner with a handful of organizations. One of those is Eternal Reefs, and they're affiliated with the Reef Ball Foundation, who makes the reef balls. The other is Veterans Memorial Reef, and so they have a kind of concrete block sort of structure, same sort of thing. And so there's actually people can go and purchase these. They kind of do a once a year sort of thing, where the ashes are put into a capsule and put into the wet concrete. And we've partnered with them and got permitting and stuff straight for them to actually deploy those on a couple of reef sites. And typically the family and friends are out there on another boat for the kind of memorial and dedication ceremony. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's lovely. Love that. Let's see. Scott wants to know if they can donate an old sailboat as a reef.
We appreciate the interest. We've got a pretty strict set of guidelines that we have to follow as far as vessels. Those are typically going to be thick, kind of steel hulled. We don't really like to use anything much thinner than about a 1/2 inch steel plate on the hull. Things just don't last. So appreciate the interest in the sailboat, but it's not something we can use.
This person's name was Scott Byram.
Yeah, that's my father.
Okay. Hi, Scott. Thanks for watching. Let's see. Oh, Ken's got a great question. Are there webcams on any of these reefs off North Carolina?
We don't have any that DMF hosts, but Frying Pan Tower has they do have a webcam out there, which is very close to one of our reef sites, AR 400. You can find that and find the highlights for that on YouTube. It's normally floating around, live stream of that's normally floating around on a TV, floating somewhere around in my office, in one of the other offices around here.
I like that folks who already spend their days out on reefs also put the reefs on television to watch.
Yeah, when they're stuck in the office and when the wind's blowing or something like that, it's a little window to the ocean.
Window to the ocean. Let's see. Marilyn read about the 3D printing of reefs using cement. Is that how the reef balls are made?
So the reef balls are typically precast. They have molds, and the wet concrete's poured in there. So slightly different technology or slightly different methodology for constructing them, but broadly kind of similar result. Mm-hmm.
Do you notice if the fish communities differ between artificial reefs and natural structures?
So we actually have partnered with some local researchers that are doing some work on this. What we do notice is that things like ships that are typically higher in the water column typically have a different sort of species assemblage as to some of the lower profile rocky reefs that are more natural. The concrete pipe and things like that are very similar in the kind of species groups to the natural kind of rocky reefs. But the ships do tend to bring in more of the kind of pelagic species like amberjacks and king mackerel and things like that.
Cool stuff. All right, let's see. The next question that came in is the side scan sonar hull mounted in the vessel, or is it a towed array?
So years ago we used to actually have a tow fish that sat behind the boat and pulled it along. We actually have upgraded, I guess 5 or 6 years ago, to one that's actually a pole mounted. So it lifts up over the side of the gunnel and drops down straight beside the boat, and it's affixed to the gunnel low enough that it can shoot underneath the keel of the boat. And because we do so much work in the estuary, having something that is, that we can move around in shallow water like that made more sense to us than getting a tow fish. Although we would probably get better imagery out in some of the deeper stuff with a towed unit.
Great stuff. Let's see. And then Marty wanted to know if you could tell us about the online reef guide and the reef publication.
Yeah, so we have the interactive reef guide. I touched on that briefly. So that's located on the Marine Fisheries website. If you go to the artificial reef page, it's right there. It's the first thing you see. And so we're constantly kind of updating that. So way back in the 90s, we had a paper reef guide that was printed that kind of had locations of materials on these reef sites. That was redone in 2015 or 2016. We reprinted a bunch of copies of that. I think almost 15 or 20,000 of those. They're spiral bound, and they have each of the reef sites and coordinates for all the materials there. But the downside to printed things is that as soon as you print them, they're out of date. So those don't have any of the things we've done in the last 5 or 6 years, but those are all housed on our interactive reef guide on the Artificial Reef webpage.
Awesome stuff. Yeah, and Marty just dropped a link for that in the chat. So perfect. People can go and take advantage of that. Which, I'm curious, these reefs provide habitat for fish and all kinds of other species of things that live in the ocean, I'm sure. How do you say rate the health of our coastal environment in decisions about where to assemble reefs? Like, is the Carolina coast like pretty stable, pretty healthy, and we can just like notch it up a little bit? Or do you see places that like really need help? Like we've been losing fish species and you say, we need to do some conservation action in this spot.
So more of that's really kind of focused on a lot of the oyster work we do. Oysters are they're not in great shape in most places, North Carolina included. Water quality issues, over harvest from decades ago, and just habitat destruction. These are things that we're really trying to working to help restore. We partner with the North Carolina Coastal Federation. They're a big name in some of the oyster restoration work. And our partnership enables us to build some of these large oyster sanctuaries that help produce a lot of the larvae that help restore oysters to Pamlico Sound.
Excellent. Great stuff. All right, let me take one last trip through the chat here just to make sure that I got everybody's thoughts in here. And looks like we did. Jordan, thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Enjoyed it.
This was a really great presentation. The next time, I had the opportunity not too long ago to take a group of school teachers out to the Carolina Beach area.
Yeah.
Where we were talking about coastal issues and as well as like longleaf pine and stuff like that, habitats that are found in that area. And I'm excited to be able to go back and just like add one more thing to that experience to talk about not only, like hardened structures on the coast or coastal erosion and sea level rise, but also, what's happening off the coast or, in the sounds.
Well, if you're at Carolina Beach State Park, we have a reef there, AR 491, that's visible from the beach right there at the state park. That's got some small rock in there and is actually growing oysters. So next time you're there, you include that in your spiel.
I can point at it and say it's right there.
You'll see the post right there on the corners. Yep.
Oh, I've probably seen it and didn't even realize it was there.
You may have. It's got like 12 by 12 signs and like 4x4 posts. Yep.
Oh, there were signs on it and I still missed it. Well, I'll work on that.
There you go.
Let's see. You know what? I'm going to take another question just popped in.
Okay.
With the warming of the oceans, have you observed it affecting the reefs, or do you anticipate any impacts?
I will say right now, I mentioned some of the more kind of tropical sort of species, aquarium type species that we've noticed on some of the reefs. I think that is something that anecdotally we have noticed. Seems to be some of these more southern species have made their way up. They show up here in June, July, August when the water's warm. But things that historically we kind of didn't really see. Don't have any hard data on that, but we have anecdotally just kind of noticed these in some of our video observations and reports of what people were catching on these reefs.
Makes sense. And I guess you and the team will be out there monitoring and keeping track of those things as we move forward.
Yeah.
Excellent stuff. Jordan, thank you once again. To all the viewers, thanks for tuning in to this edition of the Lunchtime Discovery Series. We will be back here again next Wednesday at noon with another special program for you. Next Wednesday, we will be celebrating Pride Month here at the Lunchtime Discovery Series with the 4th edition of our LGBTQ plus STEM leaders panel discussion. So I've got 3 fantastic people lined up who are going to join me on the program, and we're going to have an awesome conversation about challenges, mentorships, success in STEM Don't miss out. Next Wednesday at noon, you can subscribe to the museum's YouTube channel and click the bell to get notified. That way you can get the notification and come join us right when we get started. And of course, you can follow the museum online on all social media platforms. We're at Natural Sciences. Naturalsciences.org is the website where you can find calendar event listings for all of these programs. And you can find that information as well at the Office of Environmental Education. Online, they are eenorthcarolina.org or at North Carolina EE on Facebook and Twitter. Until next time, everybody, next Wednesday at noon, take care, stay safe, do your part to keep your community safe, and we'll see you again soon. Bye, everybody.